Before we unveil the secrets hidden behind the velvet curtains of London society, if you enjoy stories filled with romance, intrigue, and the whispers of the past, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these tales to life. Now let us step into the ballroom. The reflection in the gilded vanity mirror did not seem to belong to Lady Theodora Cavendish. It stared back with eyes that held too many secrets for a young woman of 21, framed by dark curls pinned into a submission as rigid as the social rules governing her life. It was the spring of 1847, a season that promised new blooms, but for Theodora felt more like the closing of a cage. She adjusted the bodice of her pale blue silk gown, a garment that cost more than a tenant farmer earned in a year, designed to advertise her as the perfect bride, wealthy, docile, and beautiful. She took a deep breath, watching the rise and fall of the silk against her skin, and mentally affixed the mask she wore for the world. Tonight was the Ashford Ball, the pinnacle of the season, and she had a role to play. The carriage ride to the Ashford estate was a blur of her mother's anxious chatter about potential suitors and the necessity of securing a match before the season waned. Theodora nodded at the appropriate intervals, her mind drifting elsewhere, specifically to a figure she prayed would not be there, yet simultaneously ached to see. When they arrived, the sensory assault was immediate. The ballroom glittered with an aggressive splendor, the light from 1,000 beeswax candles refracting off crystal chandeliers and diamond necklaces alike, creating a dazzling, shifting landscape of gold and white. The air was thick with the scent of hot wax, expensive perfume, and the underlying metallic tang of ambition. The orchestra played a waltz, the music swelling to cover the whispers of gossip that were the true currency of this room. Theodora stood near the terrace doors, feigning interest in the manicured gardens visible through the glass, while her mother, the Marchioness of Carrington, scanned the room like a general surveying a battlefield. But Theodora was not looking at the garden. Her gaze, drawn by a magnetic force she had spent 4 years trying to resist, found him instantly. Hugh Sinclair, the Duke of Blackmire. He stood on the opposite side of the room, a dark anchor in a sea of pastel silks and colourful regimentals. He was not dancing, he rarely did. He stood with the stillness of a statue, his black evening coat fitting his broad shoulders with a severity that matched his expression. To the rest of London, the Duke was an enigma, wealthy, powerful, and utterly bored. He possessed a sharp, intimidating jawline and piercing grey eyes that seemed to dissect the room with cold indifference. Debutantes fluttered their fans at him, and ambitious mothers plotted closer approaches, but he remained aloof, a fortress that no one had managed to breach. Theodora watched him with a painful familiarity. She had memorized him. She knew the slight tension in his posture when he was irritated, the way his hand tightened around a champagne flute when the conversation became tedious. She had loved him since she was 17, a silent, agonizing devotion that had survived 4 years of his complete obliviousness. To him, she was just another face in the crowd, a background character in the tedious play of society. To her, he was the only thing in the room that felt real. Her reverie was shattered by the approach of her own designated fate. Lord Whitlock swept toward her, trailing her mother and looking every inch the storybook prince. With golden hair and a smile practiced in front of mirrors, Whitlock was the season's prize. He was the son of an earl, heir to a fortune, and possessed a charm that melted the resolve of dowagers and debutantes alike. He took Theodora's gloved hand, pressing a kiss just above her knuckles that lasted a fraction of a second too long, a subtle claim of ownership that made her skin crawl beneath the kid leather. The narration of his compliments was smooth, a stream of praise about her appearance that felt less like admiration and more like an appraisal of a prized mare at auction. Theodora forced the corners of her mouth upward, performing the politeness that had been drilled into her since birth. Her mother beamed, seeing only the union of two great houses, blind to the coldness in Whitlock's blue eyes. He did not look at Theodora. He looked at the way she reflected light, at the status she would bring him. He spoke of the supper dance, assuming her acceptance as a foregone conclusion, his voice carrying a presumptuous intimacy that set Theodora's teeth on edge. As he spoke, his gaze darted around the room, calculating, assessing, never truly resting on her. There was a hunger in him, but it was not for love. It was a hunger for possession, for the validation that came with securing the best of everything. The heat of the ballroom began to feel oppressive, the walls closing in. The mixture of Whitlock's cloying cologne and the stifling scent of lilies became suffocating. Theodora murmured a vague excuse about the temperature, her voice sounding thin and distant to her own ears. Before Whitlock could offer to escort her, she slipped away, moving with a desperate grace toward the terrace doors. She needed air. She needed to escape the suffocation of her future, if only for a moment. Stepping out onto the stone terrace was like emerging from underwater. The cool April air bit at her flushed cheeks, shocking her senses back to clarity. The noise of the ball faded into a dull roar behind the thick glass, replaced by the rustle of wind in the ivy and the distant sound of carriage wheels on gravel. The garden was bathed in shadows, lanterns casting long, distorted shapes. Across the stone balustrade, Theodora walked to the edge, gripping the cold stone, and exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding all evening. Here, in the dark, she allowed the mask to slip. The melancholy washed over her. A future married to a man she did not trust, a life of managing a household and bearing heirs, while her heart remained locked in a vault belonging to a duke who would never know she existed. She was so lost in her bleak contemplation that she did not hear the footsteps behind her. They were heavy, deliberate steps, unlike the skittering pace of servants. When a voice spoke from the shadows, deep and resonant, Theodora nearly jumped out of her skin. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs, to find the object of her impossible affection standing in the doorway. The Duke of Blackmire. He stepped out of the gloom and into the pool of lantern light, his expression grave. He did not offer the usual pleasantries or the empty flirtations of a chance encounter. His presence on the terrace was an anomaly. Hugh Sinclair did not chase debutantes into gardens. Theodora curtsied, her knees trembling not from social deference, but from the sheer shock of his proximity. She stammered a greeting, but he waved it away, his focus entirely on her. He seemed to be wrestling with himself, his usual composure fractured by an internal conflict. He moved closer, and the scent of sandalwood and rain clung to him, overwhelming her senses. He told her, with a bluntness that was characteristic of him, that he needed to speak with her urgently. The word urgent hung in the air between them, heavy and strange. Why would the Duke of Blackmire have urgent business with Theodora Cavendish? He hesitated, a rare sign of uncertainty for a man who commanded rooms with his silence. He explained that he had debated the propriety of speaking, that he had wrestled with his conscience, but found he could not remain silent. The narrative of his speech was not romantic. It was clinical, serious, and laced with a grim determination. He told her that his concern involved Lord Whitlock. Theodora's confusion deepened. She had expected a rebuke for being alone, or perhaps a polite request to return inside. She had not expected this. The Duke's grey eyes bore into hers, stripping away the social niceties. He asked if she was aware of the true nature of the man she was courting. Before she could answer, he began to dismantle the meticulously crafted image of Lord Lucian Whitlock. He spoke not of rumours, but of facts known only in the darkest corners of London's gentlemen's clubs. He revealed that Whitlock was not merely a charmer, but a man drowning in a sea of vice. The Duke detailed a history of staggering gambling debts that had been quietly covered by a desperate father until the coffers ran dry. But it was not just money. With a voice devoid of judgment but heavy with warning, Hugh described a man who frequented the most disreputable gaming hells, a man whose appetites for destruction had left a trail of ruin in his wake. He spoke of Whitlock's reputation as a rake of the First Order, not the romanticized rogue of novels, but a predator who viewed women as collateral. The revelation hit Theodora with the force of a physical blow. The handsome face of her suitor, the polite smiles, the charming compliments. It was all a veneer, a thin layer of gold paint over rotting wood. The Duke explained that Whitlock's pursuit of her was not born of affection, but of financial necessity. Her dowry was the target. She was merely the key to unlocking it. The coldness she had sensed, the possessiveness, suddenly made terrifying sense. She was a lifeline to a drowning man, and he would pull her down with him without a second thought. Theodora stood frozen, the cool night air doing nothing to quell the heat rising in her blood. She felt a mixture of horror and humiliation. How had she been so blind? How had her father, a prudent man, been so easily deceived? But beneath the shock, another emotion surged. Confusion. Why was he telling her this? Why did the aloof, indifferent Duke of Blackmire care if she was ruined by a fortune hunter? She found the courage to ask him. She stripped the politeness from her voice and asked why a man she barely knew would risk a scandal to warn her. Hugh Sinclair looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that made Theodora feel as though he could see the soul she hid so carefully. He did not speak of love. He did not speak of passion. He told her, with a quiet intensity that shattered her defenses, that he knew her to be a woman of quality. He had watched her, he admitted, though he did not say for how long. He believed she deserved better than to be the victim of a scoundrel's desperation. He framed it as a matter of honor, a duty of one gentleman to protect the daughter of another, but there was a current beneath his words, a tension that suggested this intervention cost him more than he was willing to reveal. He did not wait for her gratitude. Having delivered the poison that would kill her courtship, he stepped back, the mask of the indifferent Duke sliding back into place. He advised her to watch Whitlock closely, to look past the charm and see the desperation, and then he turned to leave. He vanished back into the glittering maw of the ballroom, leaving Theodora alone on the terrace. The silence that followed was heavier than before. The garden no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like the edge of a cliff. She stood there, her heart racing, armed with a terrible truth and the devastating realization that the man she loved had just saved her life, all while confirming he viewed her only as a charity case, a damsel to be rescued and then forgotten. But as she stared at the empty doorway, Theodora realized that the game had changed. The mask was cracked and she could no longer pretend not to see the monsters hiding in plain sight. The morning sun that filtered through the heavy velvet drapes of Carrington House brought no warmth to the chill that had settled in Theodora's bones. The revelation on the terrace had shattered the lens through which she viewed her world. Armed with the Duke of Blackmire's warning, she did not retreat into the safety of denial. Instead, she moved with the cold precision of a woman navigating a minefield. The first step was not confrontation, but verification. Theodora sought an audience with her father, the Marquis of Carrington, in the austere silence of his study. She did not speak of feelings or the trembling of her hands. She spoke of facts. She relayed the Duke's words with a detached calm, presenting the accusations of gambling debts and moral decay as if they were lines in a ledger. The Marquis, a man who valued reputation above all else, listened with a deepening frown etched into his weathered features. He did not dismiss the claims, for the source was the Duke of Blackmire, a man whose integrity was as unassailable as his wealth. By noon, the Carrington family solicitor, Mr. Finch, had been summoned. A man of ink-stained fingers and discreet whispers, Finch was dispatched not to the polished drawing-rooms of Mayfair, but to the shadowy underbelly of London's financial district. The waiting was an exercise in agony. For 2 days, Theodora continued the charade, attending tea parties and musical recitals, forcing smiles while her mind replayed the Duke's warning. She watched Lord Whitlock from across crowded rooms, no longer seeing a suitor, but a desperate actor performing for his survival. She noticed the slight fraying of his cuffs, the feverish brightness in his eyes when the topic of dowries arose in general conversation, and the way his gaze lingered too long on the jewellery worn by the matrons of the ton. When Mr. Finch returned, he brought with him a dossier of ruin. The investigation had been swift and devastatingly conclusive. The Duke had understated the severity of the situation. Lord Whitlock was not merely in debt, he was destitute. His inheritance had been dissolved in the hazy, smoke-filled rooms of gaming hells in Covent Garden. There were outstanding notes of hand held by men who did not subscribe to the gentleman's code of honour, and whispers of a looming warrant for his arrest should the funds not materialize soon. The courtship of Theodora Cavendish was not a romance. It was a frantic bid for a financial lifeline. The Marquis of Carrington sat behind his mahogany desk, the evidence spread before him, his face pale with the rage of a father who realized his daughter had been targeted as prey. The severance was immediate, but it had to be surgical to avoid the splatter of scandal. A letter was drafted, polite but icy, informing Lord Whitlock that the courtship was at an end. No specific reasons were given. To list them would be to invite a public defence. But the tone made it clear that any further pursuit would be met with the full social and legal force of the Carrington influence. Theodora watched the wax seal harden on the envelope, feeling a strange mixture of relief and hollowness. She had been saved, yes, but the rescue had stripped away the innocence of her social experience. She saw the ballroom now as a marketplace, and herself as goods that had nearly been sold to a counterfeit merchant. However, silence in London society is a vacuum that demands to be filled. Lord Whitlock, cornered and desperate, did not accept the rejection with grace. Denied the Carrington fortune, his house of cards began to collapse with alarming speed. The scandal did not seep slowly. It exploded. 3 nights after the letter was sent, the facade of the Golden Boy crumbled in the most public manner possible. It happened at the King's Theatre during the intermission of a highly anticipated opera. Whitlock, seemingly intoxicated and frantic, was confronted in the lobby not by a jealous husband, but by bailiffs. The scene was grotesque in its rawness. Voices were raised, the polished veneer of aristocracy was stripped away, and the heir to an earldom was seen being physically restrained, shouting incoherent threats about powerful connections that no longer existed. The news raced through the theatre boxes before the second act began. By the following morning, it was the only topic of conversation in every drawing room in London. The details were embellished with every retelling. Some claimed he had tried to flee to the continent, others that he had pawned his family ring, but the core truth remained. Lord Whitlock was ruined, and the Carringtons had narrowly escaped entanglement in his disgrace. Theodora found herself at the center of a storm of speculation. Had she known? Had she been heartbroken? Was she the one who exposed him? She became a subject of pity and curiosity, a position she found intolerable. It was in this turbulent wake that the Duke of Blackmire made his second unexpected move. Theodora attended a gallery exhibition a week after the scandal broke. her mother insisting that they must be seen to prove they were not hiding in shame. The room was stifling, the whispers following Theodora like a physical weight. She felt the eyes of the ton on her back, dissecting her composure. Then the atmosphere in the room shifted. The crowd parted, and Hugh Sinclair entered. He did not scan the room. He moved with purpose. Ignoring the ambitious mothers who sought to catch his eye, he walked directly to where Theodora and her mother stood. He did not speak of Whitlock. He did not offer condolences, which would have been an admission of her humiliation. Instead, he greeted the Marchioness with impeccable courtesy, and then turned his attention to Theodora. He asked her opinion on a landscape painting hanging nearby, engaging her in a critique of the artist's use of light and shadow. It was a mundane conversation on the surface, but the subtext was screamingly loud to everyone watching. The Duke of Blackmire, the most elusive and discerning man in London, was publicly aligning himself with the Carrington family. He was signaling that Theodora was not damaged goods, but a lady worthy of his attention. The whispers of pity died instantly, replaced by a new, frantic strain of gossip. The interaction lasted less than 10 minutes, but the effect was absolute. By standing beside her, by treating her with marked respect in the face of the scandal, Hugh had thrown the mantle of his protection over her reputation. He left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving Theodora breathless and confused. His actions were those of a guardian, a benevolent protector ensuring the safety of a neighbor. It was agonizingly noble. He was saving her again, and yet he remained as distant as a star, cold, brilliant, and utterly out of reach. She wanted to scream at his retreating back, to demand to know why he cared so much if he felt nothing. But she remained silent, playing the part of the grateful lady. Seeking refuge from the exhausting scrutiny of the social season, Theodora began to retreat to the one place where she felt truly herself, the written word. She frequented Hatchard's, the oldest bookshop in London, finding solace in the dusty aisles of history and philosophy, far from the frivolous section of romantic novels where most young ladies lingered. It was here, amidst the scent of old paper and leather binding, that the next shift in the kaleidoscope of her fate occurred. She was standing on a rolling ladder, reaching for a volume of political economic theory that had been tucked away on a high shelf when she sensed a presence below. Looking down, she expected a clerk. Instead, she found herself looking into the grey, upturned eyes of the Duke. He was not dressed for a ball. He wore casual day attire, looking younger and less severe than she had ever seen him. He held a book in his own hand, his finger marking a page. He did not look bored. He looked surprised and for the first time genuinely intrigued. He stared at the book in her hand, a dense, complex treatise on the wealth of nations, and then back at her face. The silence stretched, but it was not the awkward silence of the ballroom. It was a silence of recalibration. The Duke had known Theodora Cavendish as a respectable, pretty debutante who needed saving from a rake. He had categorized her as a responsibility, a delicate flower to be protected. But delicate flowers did not climb ladders to read about the division of labor and free markets. In that quiet aisle, the dynamic fractured. He asked her with a tone of genuine curiosity that stripped away his usual hauteur why she was reading that particular text. Theodora, emboldened by the sanctuary of the books, did not offer a demure deflection. She answered him honestly. She spoke of her interest in the mechanics of the world, her desire to understand the systems that govern their lives beyond the tea tables. She spoke with passion, her eyes lighting up, forgetting for a moment that she was speaking to the Duke of Blackmire. She argued a point about the author's theory, contradicting the accepted wisdom of the time. Hugh did not correct her. He did not smile with the patronizing indulgence men usually reserved for women who expressed intellectual thoughts. He listened. He listened with a focused intensity that made the air between them crackle. He countered her argument, not to shut her down, but to test her, to see if she could hold her ground. And she did. For 20 minutes they stood in the dusty aisle, debating philosophy and economics, the rest of the world falling away. The scandal, the ballrooms, the expectations, it all evaporated. When they finally parted, prompted by the arrival of Theodora's chaperone, who looked scandalized to find her charge debating with a duke, something fundamental had changed. Hugh Sinclair did not bow and walk away with his usual indifference. He watched her leave, his expression thoughtful, the book in his hand forgotten. He had stepped in to save a damsel in distress, but in the quiet of the bookshop he had discovered that the damsel was his intellectual equal. Theodora left the shop with her heart pounding a frantic rhythm, not just from the thrill of the debate, but from the terrifying realization that her love for him had just deepened into something far more dangerous. She was no longer just admiring a distant image. She had connected with the man beneath the title. But as the season rolled on, the consequences of this new connection began to ripple outward. The Duke's behavior changed. He began to appear at events he notoriously despised. He was seen at garden parties, at tedious musical evenings, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Theodora. The society matrons whispered that the Duke was finally hunting for a bride, and the competition, sensing his new availability, sharpened their claws. Theodora found herself not just fighting the ghosts of the Whitlock scandal, but navigating a new, treacherous current. She was no longer invisible. She was being watched, assessed, and unknowingly, she was being pursued by a man who was only just beginning to realize that he was the one doing the chasing. The game had moved from the shadows of scandal into the blinding light of possibility, and Theodora had no idea if she was a player or the prize. As the summer heat began to rise in London, so too did the intensity of a gaze that could no longer look away. The Duke had seen the mind behind the beauty, and once seen, it could not be unseen. But in a world built on appearances, seeing the truth is only half the battle. Admitting it is where the real danger lies. London society, a beast that usually fed on predictability and rigid patterns, found itself unsettled by a new and inexplicable phenomenon as the season drifted from the crispness of April into the lush, suffocating heat of June. The Duke of Blackmire, a man whose attendance at social functions had historically been as rare as a snowstorm in July, had suddenly become a fixture of the calendar. Where once he had been a phantom, appearing only when strictly necessary and vanishing before the supper hour, he was now present at musical soirees, garden breakfasts, and crowded balls. To the casual observer, it appeared that the Duke had finally succumbed to the pressure of his station, perhaps hunting for a bride among the sea of eligible debutantes. But those who looked closer, those who understood the subtle language of the aristocracy, noticed a peculiar anomaly in his behavior. Hugh Sinclair did not circulate. He did not dance with the rotating line of hopeful young ladies who filled his dance card in their dreams. He stood at the edges of rooms, his grey eyes scanning the crowds with the focused intensity of a hawk hunting in tall grass. He endured the inane chatter of ambitious mothers and the preening of fops with a stoicism that bordered on pain, waiting. He was waiting for a specific presence, a specific intellectual spark that he had tasted in a dusty bookshop aisle and now found himself addicted to. He told himself it was mere curiosity, a desire to finish a debate on economic theory, but the subconscious drive that pulled him out of his solitude was far more primal. He was a man waking up from a long, monochromatic sleep, suddenly desperate for color. The culmination of this strange new behavior occurred at the Ashworth garden party, an event renowned for its extravagance and its sheer, overwhelming scale. The Ashworth estate, located just outside the city, had been transformed into a theatrical stage of nature. Manicured lawns stretched down to a shimmering lake, and a rose garden, famous throughout England, was in full riotous bloom. The air was heavy with the scent of crushed grass, blooming florals, and the expensive perfumes of 500 guests. Theodora Cavendish arrived with her parents, shielding her eyes beneath the brim of a lace parasol. She felt a distinct unease. Since the encounter at Hatchard's, she had felt the Duke's gaze on her at various events, a tangible weight that made her skin prickle. Yet he had not approached her directly. It was a game of orbit, two celestial bodies circling a gravity well that neither dared to name. She wandered away from the main tent, seeking refuge from the stifling press of bodies and the endless interrogation about her fortunate escape from Lord Whitlock. Her path led her toward the rose garden, a labyrinth of high hedges and exploding colour that offered a semblance of privacy. She was admiring a particularly violent shade of crimson rose when the gravel crunched behind her. She did not need to turn to know who it was. The silence that followed the footsteps was charged, vibrating with a tension that erased the noise of the distant party. When she finally turned, Hugh Sinclair was standing there. He looked out of place among the frivolous pastels of the garden, dressed in severe dark tailoring that seemed to absorb the bright summer light. He did not offer a meaningless greeting. Instead, he picked up the thread of conversation they had dropped in the bookshop weeks prior, referencing a counter-argument to her point on market fluctuations as if no time had passed at all. It was disorienting and thrilling. There were no pleasantries about the weather or the roses. There was only the immediate, electrifying connection of two minds colliding. They walked together through the winding paths of the garden, hidden from the prying eyes of the main lawn by walls of green and thorn. The conversation drifted from economics to philosophy, and then, dangerously, to the personal. The Duke spoke of his estates not as a source of pride, but as a burden of history, revealing a weariness with the performance of nobility that he had never shown to another soul. Theodora, in turn, found herself admitting her frustration with the limited scope of a woman's life, her hunger for a world that extended beyond embroidery and domestic management. In the quiet of the garden, the dynamic shifted irrevocably. Hugh stopped walking and looked at her. It was not the look of a mentor or a protector. It was a look of realization. He saw her not just as intelligent but as vital. The narrative of his own life, which he had viewed as a predetermined march of duty, suddenly seemed malleable in her presence. He realized with a jolt of terrifying clarity that he did not want to leave this garden. He wanted to remain in this suspended reality, where he could speak without a filter and be understood without judgment. Theodora felt the shift, too. The air between them grew thin, the space separating them charged with unspoken words. For a moment, it seemed as though the carefully constructed barriers of propriety would shatter entirely. But reality, in the form of London society, is a jealous intruder. The sound of high-pitched giggling and the rustle of silk announced the arrival of Lady Charlotte Peyton and her entourage. They burst into the secluded path like a flock of noisy birds, shattering the intimacy of the moment. Lady Charlotte, a beauty of classic proportions and minimal depth, halted when she saw the Duke. Her eyes widened, darting between Hugh and Theodora with predatory calculation. She immediately launched into a bubbling stream of conversation, ignoring Theodora entirely to focus her full arsenal of charm on the Duke. She spoke of the heat, the refreshment tent, and her desire for a boat ride on the lake, heavily implying that the Duke should be the one to row her. The reaction was instantaneous. Theodora stepped back, the spell broken. She felt the sudden, crushing weight of her station. Lady Charlotte was the expected choice for a duke, rich, uncomplicated, and perfectly trained in the art of being decorative. Theodora felt like an impostor who had been caught trying on a crown that didn't fit. She murmured an excuse, preparing to withdraw and leave the field to the proper players. However, the Duke did not play his expected role. As Theodora moved to retreat, Hugh's expression hardened. He did not offer his arm to Lady Charlotte. He did not smile at her vapid suggestions. Instead, he looked at the interruption with a cold, undisguised irritation that stunned the group into silence. He turned his back on the golden girl of the season and directed his attention solely to Theodora, stating clearly and with a volume intended to be heard that they had not finished their discussion on the architecture of the orangery. He offered his arm to Theodora, not as a courtesy but as a shield. It was a public rejection of the social norm, a deliberate choice of substance over style. They walked away together, leaving a stunned Lady Charlotte staring at their retreating backs, the seeds of a new and bewildered gossip taking root in her mind. Yet, despite this victory, Theodora felt a tremor of fear. The Duke's preference was becoming obvious, and in London, being the object of a Duke's favour was as dangerous as it was enviable. It put a target on her back. As they parted ways at the end of the afternoon, Hugh looked at her with a new resolve. He was done with accidental meetings. He was done with the chaos of public ballrooms, where he had to fight for 5 minutes of her time. He needed to change the battlefield. 2 days later, the consequences of that resolve arrived at Carrington House on a silver tray. The butler presented the envelope to the Marquis of Carrington with a gloved hand that trembled slightly. It was an invitation, embossed with the ducal crest of Blackmire. But it was not an invitation to a ball for 500 people, nor a generic card for a garden party. It was a handwritten invitation to a private dinner party at Blackmire House. The significance of this document could not be overstated. The Duke of Blackmire did not host dinner parties. His townhouse in Mayfair was a fortress. A sanctuary he guarded jealously against the intrusion of the ton. To be invited inside was rare. To be invited to a small, intimate gathering was unprecedented for a family with an unmarried daughter, unless a specific declaration was being made. The invitation included the Marquis, the Marchioness, and specifically named Lady Theodora. As Theodora held the heavy cardstock in her hands, tracing the sharp, confident lines of the Duke's handwriting, she realized that the orbit had collapsed. He was no longer circling. He was bringing her into his world, behind the high walls of his private life. It was a move of aggressive courtship masked as social hospitality. The suspense of if he was interested had been replaced by the terrifying question of what he intended to do about it. The Duke was finished with games of chance. He had set the board, and he was inviting her to make the next move in a room where there would be no interruptions, no Lady Charlottes, and nowhere left to hide the truth. The carriage wheels rumbled over the cobblestones of Mayfair, a rhythmic drumming that matched the frantic cadence of Theodora Cavendish's heart. The invitation to Blackmire House was not merely a social courtesy, it was a summons to the inner sanctum of the most enigmatic man in London. As the vehicle turned into the sweeping drive, the house loomed against the twilight sky. A Georgian masterpiece of dark brick and stone, imposing and fortress-like. Unlike the brightly lit ballrooms of the Marquis season, Blackmire House held its power in reserve. The windows glowed with a warm amber light, suggesting an intimacy that was both inviting and terrifying. To cross the threshold was to step out of the neutral ground of society and into Hugh Sinclair's dominion. The arrival was a study in controlled tension. The Marquis and Marchioness of Carrington flanked their daughter, their own nerves betrayed by the tightness of their smiles. They were ushered into an entrance hall that smelled of beeswax and old mahogany, devoid of the ostentatious gold leaf that decorated other noble houses. Here, the wealth was quiet, ancient, and undeniable. Standing at the base of the grand staircase to receive them was the Duke. In his own home, Hugh seemed larger, more grounded. He wore evening dress with an ease that suggested he had been born in it, but his eyes, when they landed on Theodora, held a flicker of something raw, a hunger he was no longer bothering to conceal behind the veil of etiquette. The dinner party was intimate, a curated assembly of 12 guests chosen not for their rank, but for their discretion. There were no frivolous debutantes or scheming mothers present, save for Theodora's own. The seating arrangement, a map of social intent, confirmed everyone's suspicions. The Duke had placed Theodora at his right hand. It was a position of honor usually reserved for the highest-ranking duchess or the oldest matron. Yet tonight it belonged to the unmarried daughter of a marquis. The message was deafeningly loud to everyone at the table. She was the focus. Throughout the meal, the atmosphere was electric. The conversation did not idle on the weather or the latest opera. Under Hugh's subtle direction, it turned to matters of substance. Parliamentary reforms, the unrest in the industrial north, the shifting tides of European politics. To the shock of the assembled guests, Hugh did not just tolerate Theodora's presence, he actively solicited her voice. When the topic of railway expansion arose, he turned to her, waiting for her analysis with an expectant stillness that silenced the rest of the table. Theodora, buoyed by the adrenaline of the moment, met the challenge. She spoke of the economic implications she had read about, her voice clear and steady. She was not interrupted. Instead, she watched as the Duke nodded, his expression one of profound satisfaction. He was displaying her not as a decorative object, but as a partner. He was showing his world that this woman, with her sharp mind and quiet strength, belonged at the head of his table. As the final course was cleared, the custom of separating the men and women was abandoned. Hugh stood, commanding the room with a quiet authority, and announced that he wished to show his guests a recent acquisition in the library. It was a thin pretext, transparent to everyone present, yet no one dared to challenge it. The group moved through the corridors, the walls lined with the portraits of long-dead Sinclairs who watched the procession with painted eyes. The house felt alive, a breathing entity that was observing the shifting of its own destiny. The library at Blackmire House was legendary, though few had seen it. When the double mahogany doors were thrown open, Theodora understood why. It was a cathedral of knowledge. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, packed with thousands of leather-bound volumes, lined the walls. A rolling ladder stretched toward the high ceiling, and a massive fireplace dominated the far end, the flames casting dancing shadows across the Persian rugs. It was a masculine space, scented with smoke, leather, and paper, the scent of the Duke himself. The guests milled about, murmuring their appreciation, but the herd was thinning. By design or by instinct, the other guests drifted toward the far ends of the room, examining maps and artifacts, leaving a widening circle of privacy around the Duke and Theodora near the hearth. They stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the physical manifestation of his mind. The noise of the others faded into a distant hum. Hugh looked at her, and the mask of the host dropped completely. He looked shaken, as if the reality of her standing in his sanctuary was overwhelming him. He began to speak, his voice low and urgent. He confessed that he had never brought a woman into this room before. He spoke of his solitude, of the years he had spent barricading himself behind these walls, convinced that no one in the frivolous world of the ton could understand the language he spoke. And then he admitted that his calculations had been wrong. He told her that since their conversation in the bookshop, the silence of this house, which he had once cherished, had begun to feel oppressive. He was haunted, he said, by the memory of her voice. Theodora listened, her heart hammering against her ribs. Like a trapped bird, this was the moment she had dreamed of for 4 years, yet it felt different than her fantasies. It was not a flowery declaration of romantic love. It was a confession of intellectual and emotional necessity. He was telling her that she was the missing piece of his existence, but as he spoke, searching for the words to define this new connection, Theodora realized that he still did not know the whole truth. He thought this was a new discovery, a sudden spark ignited in a bookshop. He had no idea of the history she carried. The weight of the secret became unbearable. She could not build a future on a foundation of omission. She interrupted him, her voice trembling. She told him to stop. Hugh froze, fear flashing in his eyes, the fear of rejection, but Theodora did not retreat. In the quiet of the library, with the fire crackling beside them, she laid her soul bare. She told him that he was not the only one who had been watching. She confessed that this was not a new acquaintance for her. She stripped away the pride of a debutante and admitted the humiliating, beautiful truth. She had loved him since she was 17. She recounted the details, the specific ball where she first saw him, the color of his waistcoat, the way he had frowned at a bad recital, the years of collecting scraps of his attention like starving birds collecting crumbs. The revelation hit Hugh with the force of a physical impact. He stared at her, his mind racing to reorder the timeline of his life. The silence that stretched between them was thick with shock. For a man who prided himself on his observation skills, on seeing the truth behind the lies of society, this was a devastating blind spot. He realized that while he had been looking out at the world with disdain, she had been looking at him with love. The 4 years he had spent feeling alone had been a waste, a tragedy of his own making. The protection he had offered her against Whitlock, the jealousy that had consumed him, was not the beginning of something, but the culmination of a connection he had been too blind to see. The shock on his face slowly gave way to something fierce. The realization shattered the last remnants of his reserve. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until the heat of his body radiated against hers. He did not touch her, not yet, but the air between them was so charged it felt solid. He asked her, his voice rough with emotion, if she still felt it, if the years of his indifference had killed that love, or if it had survived the silence. Theodora looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and gave him the answer that would seal their fate. She told him that her heart was stubbornly, inconveniently constant, the restraint that held Hugh Sinclair together snapped. He did not drop to one knee. The time for courtly gestures had passed. This was urgent. This was a crisis management of the heart. He grasped her hands, his grip tight, desperate. He told her that they could not wait. Society would demand a long engagement, a season of pageantry, but he refused to risk losing her to the whims of fate or the interference of others. He would not spend another day in this house without the promise that she would return to it as its mistress. The proposal was not a question, it was a pact. He stated that he would speak to her father that very night before the carriages departed. He would demand a wedding by the end of the month. He outlined the plan with the precision of a general securing a victory, his eyes burning with a possessiveness that thrilled and terrified her. He was claiming her, not just as a wife, but as the anchor of his life. Theodora, swept up in the whirlwind of his intensity, nodded. She agreed to the madness. She agreed to bypass the rules, to ignore the whispers, and to seize the reality that was standing before her. Hugh brought her knuckles to his lips, pressing a kiss there that was a vow in itself. It was a moment of absolute clarity. The library, once a tomb of solitary thought, had become the birthplace of their future. But as the heavy doors of the library creaked open, breaking the spell, the reality of the world outside rushed back in. The guests were beginning to turn, eyes widening as they saw the Duke and Theodora standing together, the energy between them undeniable. The secret was out. The unspoken thing had been spoken. Now they had to face the formidable Marquis of Carrington. The Duke straightened his coat, his face settling into a mask of grim determination. He offered his arm to Theodora, and together they walked toward the door, stepping out of the sanctuary and into the line of fire, ready to demand the future they had both unknowingly waited 4 years to claim. The double doors of the library closed behind them, sealing the pact made in firelight and shadows. But the real trial was only just beginning. The distance from the library to the drawing room where the Marquis of Carrington waited was short, yet it represented the crossing of a Rubicon from which there could be no return. Hugh Sinclair, the Duke of Blackmire, a man who had faced parliamentary inquiries and financial crises with an unblinking stare, now walked with a singular, terrifying focus toward a father whose permission he required, but whose refusal he was prepared to ignore. The interview that followed in the private study of Blackmire House was brief, brutal in its efficiency, and devoid of the usual aristocratic circling. Hugh did not ask for a courtship. He demanded a wedding. He laid out his intentions with the cold precision of a military strategist, citing his title, his fortune, and most dangerously, his absolute unwillingness to wait. The Marquis, a man who had spent a lifetime reading the hidden motives of men, looked from the steely determination of the Duke to the flushed, defiant face of his daughter. He did not argue. He did not feign surprise. With a knowing smile that suggested he had been watching a game the players themselves hadn't realized they were playing, he granted his blessing. The engagement was sealed not with romantic poetry, but with a handshake that felt like the closing of a vault door. The announcement appeared in the Times 2 days later, and the effect on London society was akin to dropping a stone into a still pond. The shock waves were immediate and violent. The Ice Duke, the untouchable pillar of indifference, was marrying. And he was not marrying a stranger or a foreign princess. He was marrying Lady Theodora Cavendish, the quiet intellectual girl, who had nearly been ensnared by a scoundrel only months prior. The narrative of the season was rewritten overnight. Theodora was no longer the pitiable, almost victim of Lord Whitlock. She was the triumphant conqueror of the impossible Duke. The weeks that followed were a blur of frenetic activity that tested the sanity of every dressmaker and milliner in London. Hugh had insisted on a timeline that bordered on scandalous 6 weeks. In a world where engagements often dragged on for a year to allow for the proper accumulation of trousseaux and settlements, 6 weeks was a sprint. It fueled whispers that there must be a reason for the haste, a scandal hidden beneath the surface, but those who saw the couple together knew the truth. It was not necessity that drove the speed, it was impatience. The Duke was a man who had starved himself of affection for 32 years, and now that he had tasted it, he refused to endure the hunger for a moment longer than necessary. Theodora found herself at the center of a whirlwind. Fittings, menu, tastings, flower arrangements. It was a logistical campaign of epic proportions. Yet amidst the chaos, there was a calm center. Every evening, without fail, Hugh would arrive at Carrington House. He would sit in the drawing room, ignoring the frantic preparations of her mother, and simply exist in Theodora's space. He brought her books, not jewels. He brought her silence, not chatter. He was anchoring her, reminding her that the circus swirling around them was temporary, but the connection between them was permanent. The morning of the wedding dawned with a sky of piercing, cloudless blue, a rare gift from the English summer. St. George's, Hanover Square, the stage for society's greatest plays, was packed to the rafters. The guest list had swollen to over 300, a testament to the insatiable curiosity of the ton. They came to see the spectacle, to critique the dress, to whisper about the speed of the union. But when the heavy oak doors opened and the organs swelled into a triumphant march, the gossip died in their throats. Theodora walked down the aisle, a vision in ivory silk and Brussels lace, but it was not the dress that silenced the crowd, it was her face. There was no fear, no hesitation. She walked toward the altar with the steady, radiant confidence of a woman who knows exactly where she belongs, and waiting for her, standing by the altar with a tension that radiated from his rigid posture, was Hugh. He did not look at the crowd. He did not acknowledge the royalty in the front pews. His world had narrowed down to the woman approaching him. When she reached his side and he took her hand, the trembling of his fingers was visible only to her. The vows were exchanged in low, firm voices, stripped of theatricality. They were promises made by two people who understood the weight of the words, who knew that they were not just joining two fortunes, but healing two fractured histories. The moment the vicar pronounced them man and wife, a collective exhale seemed to ripple through the church. The Duke of Blackmire, the man who had worn his isolation like armor, kissed his duchess with a tenderness that shocked the witnesses more than any scandal could have. It was a public claiming, a final signal that the fortress had fallen. The reception was a blur of toasts and champagne, a kaleidoscope of faces and congratulations that Theodora barely registered. She moved through the rooms of Carrington House, her hand firmly clasped in Hugh's, accepting the well wishes of people who had ignored her for years. But through it all, she felt the pull of the future. The carriage that waited outside, adorned with white ribbons and crests, was not just a vehicle, it was an escape pod. When they finally broke free from the crushing weight of social obligation and the carriage door clicked shut, the silence that descended was profound. As the horses pulled away, navigating the crowded streets toward Blackmire House, Theodora leaned back against the squabs, the adrenaline fading to leave a warm, exhausted contentment. She looked at the man beside her, her husband, and saw the tension finally drain from his face. They had survived the gauntlet. 2 years is a lifetime in the narrative of a marriage. It is enough time for passion to settle into devotion, for secrets to become shared history, and for a house to transform into a home. Blackmire House, once a museum of cold perfection, had changed. The silence was gone, replaced by the sounds of life. The library, the sacred ground where the pact had been made, remained the heart of the home, but its landscape had altered. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon in November, the fire in the library hearth crackled with a comforting ferocity. Theodora sat in the oversized leather wingback chair that had once been the sole domain of the Duke. She was reading, or attempting to, but her attention kept drifting to the scene on the rug before the fire. Hugh Sinclair, the intimidating peer of the realm, was on his knees. He was building a tower of wooden blocks for a toddler who watched the construction with wide, solemn grey eyes, eyes that were a perfect mirror of his father's. Charles Edmund Sinclair, the heir to the dukedom, was 18 months old and possessed a determination that rivaled his mother's. He reached out a chubby hand and, with a squeal of delight, demolished the tower his father had painstakingly constructed. Hugh laughed, a rich, genuine sound that bounced off the book-lined walls. He did not mourn the destruction. He simply began to rebuild. Theodora watched them, a lump forming in her throat. She remembered the man she had met on the terrace, the man who had warned her about a gambler to save her from ruin. He had thought he was saving her. He had believed he was the protector, the guardian standing at the gate. He had no idea that he was the one who needed rescuing. He had been drowning in duty and isolation, trapped in a role that allowed no room for humanity. She had saved him not by fighting his battles, but by seeing him, by loving the man beneath the title, until he was brave enough to let that man exist. Hugh looked up, sensing her gaze. He abandoned the blocks and the toddler, who was now happily chewing on a wooden soldier, and moved to her chair. He knelt beside her, resting his arm on the leather, his face level with hers. The grey eyes were no longer piercing or cold. They were warm, filled with a quiet, steady light. He asked her what she was thinking, his hand finding hers and intertwining their fingers. Theodora smiled, squeezing his hand. She told him she was thinking about the terrace at the Ashford ball, about the warning he had given her. Hugh grimaced slightly, the memory of his own rigidity clearly amusing him now. He remarked that he had been a fool, blind to what was right in front of him. Theodora shook her head. She corrected him. He hadn't been blind. He had been waiting for the moment when he could be more than just a duke. He leaned in, kissing her softly, a lingering touch that spoke of 1,000 quiet mornings and 1,000 peaceful nights. He whispered that she had saved him. It was a sentiment they often shared in the quiet dark, a mutual acknowledgement of the precipice. They had both walked along. She had been on the edge of a loveless, ruinous marriage to a fraud. He had been on the edge of a lonely, hollow existence in a golden cage. They had pulled each other back. The toddler on the rug let out a demanding cry, holding up a block. Hugh sighed, the mock exasperation of a contented father, and stood up to return to his duty. Theodora watched him go, watching the way the firelight played on his shoulders, the way he bent down to speak seriously to their son about the structural integrity of wooden castles. The suspense of their early days, the fear of unrequited love, the danger of scandal, the race to the altar, had been replaced by the profound, deep-seated peace of a life fully lived. The story of the Duke and the debutante had begun with a lie, a courtship based on deception by Lord Whitlock. It had turned on a secret, a love hidden for 4 years, but it had ended in the only place that mattered, the truth. As the rain lashed against the windows, sealing them into their warm, book-filled world, Theodora knew that this was the greatest discovery of all. They hadn't just found a marriage, they had found a sanctuary, and within these walls the story would continue, written not in the gossip columns of the Tun, but in the quiet, enduring language of love. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. We are truly grateful for your presence and your time. If this story moved you, we warmly invite you to support our channel by subscribing, liking the video, leaving a comment, and sharing it with others who might enjoy stories of love, redemption, and unexpected turns. Your support, from the bottom of our hearts, helps us stay inspired to continue bringing you more heartfelt tales, each one crafted to stir your emotions and remind you that love always finds a way. At the end of this video, another story from our channel will appear. Click and let yourself be drawn into another unforgettable journey. Thank you once again for being here, the Legends of Love team.